This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so LifeLock wants to remind you to update your passwords. Using the same password across multiple accounts makes you vulnerable to cybercriminals. For comprehensive identity theft protection, let LifeLock alert you to anything suspicious and fix any issues. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, or actually, this is a special two-part episode of Disorder about the anniversary of October 7th, one of contemporary history's most disordering events. Not only in the sense that it combined a carefully calculated and planned military assault with a carnal and bloodthirsty disordering rampage, but furthermore in its effects. I'm speaking today as the Middle East is not just on the brink of a regional war, as politicians always threaten, it's actually in a regional war. Iran and Israel are involved in a direct interstate war. They have violated each other's sovereignty and given casus bellis. Israel received casus belli from Yemen and Lebanon when missiles landed on its territory, and Israeli retaliations and occupations and airstrikes have caused a war between Israel and Lebanon. As we are speaking, it appears that Israeli troops are not just making incursions into southern Lebanon, but have occupied southern Lebanon. So amidst all this chaos, it appears to me that the Palestinian question is frequently lost. It's trotted out by statesmen, by self-serving actors like the Houthis as a justification for their actions. But then, despite all these statements, what's actually being done for the Palestinians? Western policymakers speak of Israel's right to defend itself, and they sometimes mention Palestinians' rights for statehood or Palestinians' right for self-determination. But I have seen in this last year very little in a concrete way happening on these topics. Therefore, I'd like to use this two-part anniversary episode to shine a light on a few interrelated topics. In the first episode, we're going to provide an overview of last year's tragedy, the violence, the death. Then we're going to look into the question of the suffering of Gazan and West Bank Palestinians. We're also going to investigate the rise of conspiratorial anti-Semitism around the world. And in the second part of the episode, we're going to look at the Palestinian question on the international diplomatic stage, Britain's historic role in that question, the actions of Sir Keir Starmer's government to bring about Palestinian statehood, and as we attempt to order the disorder, we're going to look at the longer-term implications of the current conflict for the future of the Middle East and the world. So, to break it all down, I am joined by my very good friend for many years, Sir Vincent Fean. Sir Vincent joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in 1975, and over the course of his long and distinguished career, he was British Consul General in Jerusalem, which is essentially Britain's ambassador to the Palestinians. Just before that, he had served in Tripoli as HM ambassador to Libya, and before that, he was British High Commissioner to Malta. These days, Sir Vincent works in his retirement to urge the British government to recognize a Palestinian state in his current role as trustee and his former role of chairman of the Balfour Project. Ahlan wa sahlan fil disorder, Vincent.
Shukran jazilan. Thank you, Jason.
I want to put in a disclaimer about this pod. Obviously, we're talking about an unbelievably wide range of issues, but we did so in a live-to-tape context. So, of course, there are a million things that I'd like to add or clarify, but we weren't able to do that. I inserted a few things that I thought we omitted in the discussion after, but I didn't change any of the words that we've said. And because this is an unscripted, free-flowing conversation, of course, people are going to feel like we put a word wrong here and there, mostly me, that I wanted to say something or we left something out. And that's just the nature of talking about a very complex topic like the Israel-Palestine issue. Vincent, these are difficult times. And the reality is we're commemorating this very sober anniversary. It seems like it's become a cliche over this last year that all pundits and media personalities and politicians have to performatively begin their statements before getting into Israeli human rights abuses in Gaza or Lebanon with some kind of commemoration of the horrific events of October 7. And then they can delve into what happened since. But this is an anniversary episode. I think that the events of that fateful day are really as relevant today, and they will be in 2 or 3 years' time, as they were then. How did you feel things? Where were you on that fateful day? How have your thoughts evolved on that event over the year that's happened?
I was in London. I woke up to this news, and the feeling I had was of fear. Fear for the people of Israel. Fear because there would be inevitably retaliation by the Israeli army. Shock that Hamas had managed to achieve this horrific breakthrough. And I began to wonder, how the international community would respond. But let's go back to the beginning, the horrific nature of the attack. At least 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 kidnapped. And the image of Prime Minister Netanyahu as the defender of the people and the manager of the Palestinian issue, broken. So that was on my mind. In terms of the international community, the shock was shared. You'll remember that Prime Minister Sunak visited Israel immediately after. He wasn't the only head of government to go, and embraced Prime Minister Netanyahu and said, "We're with you." Rather as Keir Starmer recently said about the missile onslaught from Iran. Getting beyond immediate sympathy for the people of Israel, we come on to what you've discussed, what you've described, which is the year since, and the retaliation in Gaza, which has done, I would say, it has made Gaza uninhabitable. But we'll come on to that.
Well, let's come on to it. Could you recap for listeners, what is this Gaza war? If you turn on BBC or Al Jazeera, you see infinite amounts of rubble, crying children, people with ash on their faces. What has it all been about?
It's a very good question. I heard the former Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy saying Israel has tactics, where's the strategy? It's a good question. Over the last year, in response to that horrific attack, Israel has, through its military, sought revenge. The precision of previous fighting between Hamas and Israel is not there. By precision, I mean, you'll remember Israel used to speak of targeted attacks, precision bombing. That hasn't been the case here. 2.3 million Palestinians have been shuffled from pillar to post. Some killed. The figures vary, but between 40 and 60,000 killed. Many of them women and children. The point I'm trying to make is on the precision issue. The retaliation of the IDF has not been precise. It's been to obliterate.
The way you sketch it, it sounds almost deliberate. Issues of retaliation and revenge rather than targeted attacks to flush out militants and unearth their tunnels. Why would this strategy have been chosen? What is its meaning?
I think you're right that the strategy is twofold. Naturally, there has been military effort to rescue the hostages who are in tunnels in Gaza. And you'll remember that in November, there was a negotiated release of several hundred hostages in return for the release of Palestinian prisoners in Israel. And so a twofold approach. One is to combat Hamas where it is, which is in the tunnels. The second is the one I tried to describe, which is to destroy, which is what's happened, the 11 Gazan universities, to damage or destroy 70-75% of the schools, to include in the onslaught UNRWA UN facilities. So is that a strategy? It's an outcome, the result of 1 year of bombardment, mutual, because there's been Hamas bombardment into Israel, ongoing, is that Gaza's been set back decades. Children have missed a school year. That's the least of their problems. Actually, staying alive is their main challenge. So is that a strategy? That takes us on to the broader question of, can there be peaceful coexistence between Israel and her neighbors in Lebanon, in Gaza, in the West Bank? There is a degree of non-violence with Egypt and with Jordan, peace treaties which have lasted decades and are likely to last decades. But with the Palestinian people, the issue is real. Can there be peaceful coexistence, and how? And currently, can there be a peace with Lebanon, which the south of Lebanon is currently controlled by Hizbollah?
The way you sketch it, Israeli policy or IDF war aims have been deliberately to destroy schools or hospitals. Do we really know that? What about the fact that these installations were used by Hamas so that they could have human shields and that they could use civilian infrastructure and UNRWA and other things to have their militants in those buildings, knowing that then it would make it seem more horrific to international opinion when Israel targeted those installations? Isn't this a big question in the media narrative around the war, which is that essentially supporters of Israel or people on the global right within the West say, yes, it's a horrible shame that these tens of thousands of people have died, but they're human shields. Hamas really killed them by putting their command and control center in a hospital, or by having some UNRWA teachers work on the side as terrorists. And then the left says the Israelis have a deliberate policy to obliterate civilian institutions and have razed Gaza on purpose so that all of these kids would lose their homes. Obviously, the truth has to be a little of both, right? But I just want you to situate, how have you seen this year of conflict? What has the conflict, the tactical conflict in Gaza been about?
I remember the Israeli defense minister speaking 3 days after the 7th of October.
And it was still Yoav Gallant as it is now.
Yeah. He said, what we need to do is cut off the water, cut off the food, cut off the electricity. That happened. There has been a resumption of aid. The precision that I talked about has been lacking.
On purpose,
I believe so. Again, an IDF spokesman said early on, our orders are damage, not precision. I think that's a quote. So you have to look at the outcome. The outcome is that those 2.3 million people who don't have anywhere to go.
Right, they're trapped in a small area and shuffled back and forth. Each time there's a new warning, please evacuate Rafah and go north. Then in the north, please evacuate Khan Yunis and go south. And of course, it's impossible to think of what existence would be like for these people. No. And the extent of the suffering, there aren't words.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get at the logic of the conflict. And one thing that I don't see covered enough in the news is the kind of pot shots that Hamas and Islamic Jihad take at IDF soldiers as they're trying to do these operations or, get at a tunnel. We know that hundreds of Israeli soldiers have been killed in the ground operations from November 2023 until the kind of end of major ground operations in July 2024. And I haven't really understood how they're killed. In other words, there are some Israeli battalions, they're going into place, and then they're ambushed, which implies that there are Hamas military installations or ambushes from underground tunnels. What have been the things that one is fighting to control? Are you able to shed any light on this?
I think the ambition of Mr. Netanyahu is to eliminate Hamas. That's his declared goal. Several of his own ministers and IDF staff have said that's not achievable. The reality is that Hamas is an ideology and a social network, as well as a military force, terrorist military force, proscribed by the UK, US, EU. So the ambition, and it comes back to your question about strategy versus tactics, the ambition of the Prime Minister of Israel to eliminate Hamas, I believe to be unattainable.
So do I.
Coming back to your point about if you like, the Hamas soldiers turning up.
What are their aims?
Behind the lines of the Israelis and attacking from behind. What are their aims? The fighters are people, and I distinguish between the fighters and the civilians. The fighters are people who are dedicated to the cause of retrieving what they see as their land, and I believe they're prepared to die. In those circumstances, they're quite hard to stop, and I think that's probably the case with Hizbollah now as well. The objective of Hamas ultimately is to remove Israel from the map. Everybody in Hamas who has any sense will know that that is not an achievable
Do they
aim.
know that, though?
I believe so.
So I'm going to push back slightly, and I'm going to direct listeners to a really fascinating podcast about Yahya Sinwar and his background and ideology. We'll put a link in the show notes. There is something about Islamically influenced fundamentalist thinking which is deliberately magical, so that if you're an Al-Qaeda guy and, back in those days, Osama bin Laden drops a tape on Al Jazeera and he says, "We will purge the Middle East of the Crusaders and the Zionist entity." On the one hand, you might think, but how is that possible? But on the other hand, you think, I guess it's going to happen if we do these and these steps. It's not a rational thing. And therefore, when someone talks about Salah ad-Din or we are now beginning the Al-Quds liberation, whatever, we're going to have a different view on the meaning of those words. But is it not correct to say that many of the people who are doing the fighting, at least, as well as others who are willing to undertake things like martyrdom operations, believe in a mystical, or for lack of a better word, non-linear thinking about how this conflict will resolve itself?
You may be right, Jason. I have trouble putting myself in the mindset of a Hamas fighter. Maybe that's a good thing. But coming back to the reality, if I can go that way.
Yes.
The reality of the situation is that Israel is here to stay. The only people who will lead to the destruction of the state of Israel, and I don't wish it, are Israelis. Israel is not capable of being destroyed, eliminated from without. It has strategic enemies, particularly Iran today, but it is not at risk as an entity, in my opinion.
It's a bold statement, though, because Iran could nuclearize, and I am firmly of the belief that there are many actors in the region, both Sunni and Shi'i, both secular and fanatically religious, who would destroy Israel if they had a magic button. And therefore, I think it is, really, pardon my saying so, slightly glib to say that the only people who would destroy Israel are Israelis. I think the only people who could put Israel in the position that it might not be able to defend itself, or will have so enraged its own allies that it cannot defend itself, will be Israelis, but that, worded without context, maybe fails to consider the extent of the genocidal ideation on behalf of Israel's enemies.
Iran doesn't have the nuclear bomb. Israel does. The aim of Western diplomacy and politics and Biden and Kamala Harris is to ensure that Iran does not get the nuclear bomb. Coming back to who are Israel's enemies, Israel has the most sophisticated and efficient military complex and armed forces in the Middle East and possibly in the world. It can defend itself.
But it couldn't on October 7th. So I feel like we always need to reframe here. I remember waking up that morning in New Jersey with my then girlfriend, and we looked at the news and she said, "Oh, it's one of these Middle East wars again." And I looked at the news and I said, "No, it isn't. This is entirely unprecedented." I thought that because of all the judicial reforms and the protests against them and the servicemen and IDF air reservists saying that they wouldn't fight, that Israel's intelligence and fighting capacities were slightly harmed. I didn't grasp that they had been eviscerated and that the neo-populists were so asleep at the wheel that such a thing like that could happen. But we can't have it both ways, whereby you're saying that Israel is existentially so profoundly powerful that it doesn't have these real threats. And then the October 7th happened. How? Do you know what I mean? And I obviously have to nip in the bud any conspiracy theory like, oh, well, Netanyahu wanted it to happen so he could allow his genocidal war on the Palestinians. Yeah. Oh, but I hear it even from Arab colleagues of mine. Or the Israeli right put all the troops in the West Bank on purpose and they didn't rush the troops to defend the southern kibbutzim because they wanted there to be a massacre so they could retaliate. I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is just that neopopulism doesn't provide solutions. It always is incompetent. And what we have right now is a situation where neopopulism globally is incompetent. And it's deliberately incompetent. But we then can't also say, well, the Israelis have such a sophisticated military, of course they can defeat their enemies. Because no, they've had 20 years of insane neopopulist rule where what I see is that some aspects of the Israeli society, like the high-tech sector, work very brilliantly. Some bits of the army and the intelligence work, but it's a society and late neopopulism. Their society doesn't really function.
I come back to the point about Israel itself. I'm not the world's expert on Israel. My time was spent talking to Palestinians. Yeah. But I witnessed several elections. Let's say one thing. Israel, within the Green Line, the 1967 borders, is a functioning democracy with a robust press. They have many contradictions internally, the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox who don't serve in the armed forces and the pressure from within the Knesset and the Supreme Court for that to be changed. That's one element. There is the other element that Netanyahu came back into power determined to depress the Supreme Court rather than to sustain it. Those are real things. But I come back to the external threats.
Yes.
And Hamas is not a strategic threat, an existential threat to the state of Israel. Hizbollah, in my opinion, is not an existential threat to the state of Israel. The state of Israel is intact and has a functioning armed forces. You asked how 7 October happened. I think there were people who were asleep on the watch. And there were some battalions transferred to the West Bank to keep settlers safe in the West Bank at the expense of the protection of the kibbutzim in South Israel.
Yes.
That's all true. I regard that as an isolated incident, tragic, brutal, rather than a sign of things to come. I think that what has happened in the ensuing period is that Hamas has been weakened militarily and strengthened politically. They have moved from being the brutal attackers of the 7th of October
to being victims.
To being the victims and defenders of victims
yes.
in Gaza and to a certain extent, limited extent, the West Bank. That means they are popular among ordinary Arabs and popular among ordinary Palestinians. I think that's misleading and wrong because I don't think they have the answer to this question that we need to address, which is how can Palestinians and Israelis coexist in peace in the 21st century, which they are currently not doing.
And after the break, we're going to investigate the rise of conspiratorial anti-Semitism around the world over the last year, and we're going to look at the current state of Palestinian political institutions.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so LifeLock wants to remind you to update your passwords. Using the same password across multiple accounts makes you vulnerable to cybercriminals. For comprehensive identity theft protection, let LifeLock alert you to anything suspicious and fix any issues. Start protecting your identity today with a 30-day free trial at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
So, Vincent, you've explained a lot about the destruction and tragedy in Gaza and your view that there is no Israeli strategy other than retaliation. That may well be right, and I feel like that's become the accepted wisdom. Today, we're commemorating the October 7th anniversary of the horrific massacre. I feel that the massacre has faded from people's minds, maybe not policymakers' minds who know to reference it, but from regular people's minds in the West. And what about it has faded from their minds, for non-Jews this is, and non-Israelis? What's fated is that this is an unprecedented event in modern history where an essentially civilian population, the Gazan population, massacred, raped, kidnapped, tortured another civilian population, the Israeli population in the kibbutzim and at the music festival in Nova, in an unprovoked way. People will say, oh, it's provoked, it's 80 years of settlement, it's nearly 2 decades of the closure of Gaza and its embargo. Those don't justify and they don't provide the background for what was a medieval pogrom of the kind that we had in 1840 in Damascus, in the 1090s in Germany, in the 1880s and 1890s in Ukraine and Belarus in the Pale of Settlement. And why am I linking it only to pogroms? Because my contention is that when we commemorate this event of the October 7th, it must be commemorated in the continuum of Jewish history. And this is a history not just of persecution, but of conspiratorial hate. The Jews run the world. George Soros controls this. The reason it's impossible for Western leaders to not give arms to Israel is the Zionists control the U.S. Congress. Every conspiratorial sentiment is at the core of what happened on October 7th. I contend that you couldn't have Mexican gangs breaking into Texas and committing an October 7th-like event. They simply don't have enough hate in their hearts. And even in other conflicts where there is hate, you couldn't get non-soldiers who are not directed in a specific way to do this activity. But looking back at October 7th, what we have to see from my perspective is that it unleashed throughout the whole world these copycat conspiratorial hate protests. The protests began in Times Square and in London on October 8th. Before the Israeli attack began, you had events saying, stop the Israeli genocide in London and New York and Paris before the Israelis had gone into Gaza and retaliated. And that's because this narrative of conspiratorial Jewish and Israeli settler colonialism and quote-unquote genocide has just become at such a fever pitch that it is not connected to Israeli actions. And therefore, when Gutierrez or others have said, you need to look at October 7th in its historical continuum, the only correct historical continuum, to my perspective, is conspiratorial and delusional anti-Semitism that allows the kind of protests across Europe and North America and Australia. And I don't think that that part is talked enough about, that the October 7th has allowed the essentially de-assimilation of Jews throughout the West in many places because they don't feel safe or they feel completely persecuted, and the rise of a kind of politics that was familiar from the 1890s to 1930s, treating otherwise assimilated Jews who participate in their Western societies in a normal way as fifth columns. So those are my 2 cents on how we need to commemorate October 7th. But I think the conversation that's more productive for you and I to have, Vincent, is I feel like people don't hear enough about what's happened in the West Bank. Not only Israeli settler violence, but Palestinian protests, sometimes knife attacks, and then the land grab that, and it's tragic for me, it's mostly Jews born in Brooklyn and places like that who are doing this land grab in a bizarre way. And not necessarily clear to me if the Israeli state is orchestrating it, turning a blind eye, what those relationships are. How would you summarize what has happened in the West Bank over the last year, and what are its implications?
The West Bank is 3.5 million people, Palestinian people, and 700,000 settlers. Ramallah is the hub and the administrative center under President Abbas and a current Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa, technocratic government. After the 7th of October, Israel did several things. cut off the tax returns that Israel, under the Oslo Accords, collected on behalf of the Palestinians and then handed over with a small commission.
And as a point of explanation, that's because Bezalel Smotrich, the far-right Israeli politician, is in the cabinet for the first time in history. Such far-right settler leaders have occupied main cabinet positions, and he's the one who controls those tax revenues. Whereas in the past, it would have been, not that Likud guys are centrists, but it would have been a mainstream Israeli politician who wouldn't likely have taken that step, right?
That's right. What that means is that under this government, and you're right to say that there are Jewish supremacists in this government, Smotrich and National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, this government is different from its predecessors in its disinclination to support the Palestinian Authority. Cutting off the money, the Palestinian money, you can call it, because they are tax revenues and customs and excise revenues that do belong to the Palestinian Authority, and there's no dispute about that, is an act of destruction. So the Palestinian Authority is limping at best. You talked rightly, Jason, about the situation of the settlers and settler violence and the land grab. What we've seen in the last year is a great acceleration in the extension of settlements and the legalization of outposts, which used to be illegal even under Israeli law.
Vincent, you've talked a lot about Netanyahu and the Israeli state's responsibility for deliberately damaging Palestinian civilian and humanitarian infrastructure, for blowing up Lebanon now. You've talked about Hamas and its brutality, but you haven't really talked about the Israeli people's responsibility, whether it's for settlements or for this war, or the Palestinian people's responsibility for terror. I think it's important to insert something on those topics. The Israeli people are a democracy, as you pointed out, and they voted for Netanyahu, and for the large part, they approved the war. I believe that if they had better leadership, they wouldn't have approved a war in this way. They just want to get the hostages back, and they want to punish Hamas. But you can say that the Israeli people support a military and securitized defense strategy. But you can't say that without pointing out that Palestinians have not fought a civil war against Hamas. Palestinians voted for Hamas back in 2006. Then it's true that elections were canceled. But the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, many of them support terror attacks. Every poll shows that it's like 40+% who support jihadi and suicide bombings. And Palestinians celebrated when the October 7th happened, and almost no one did anything to stop it. And they haven't supported either Israel in trying to fight Hamas or supported alternative leaderships in the Palestinian territory. So that's really important to throw out. This is a war between two peoples, and many Lebanese don't support Hezbollah, but they're not willing to fight to take away Hezbollah's missiles. And many Palestinians don't support Hamas, but they're not willing to fight Hamas to take away its missiles and rockets and terror planning capacity. And that's important to toss out.
Something has happened that might contribute to a restoration of order, but that depends on international political will. That is, in July, the International Court of Justice produced an advisory opinion, non-binding advisory opinion, which said the occupation of 1967 is unlawful. That has implications. It has implications that engage every UN member state, including Israel. Israel has rejected the advisory opinion and recently declared the UN Secretary General persona non grata. Guterres cannot now go to Israel or the West Bank or Gaza because Israel controls access there. But this International Court of Justice advisory opinion matters because the ICJ, as they call it, is the Supreme Court in the world.
Of the UN system.
Of the UN system. But there isn't another. There's the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is also UN-related, but is more about criminality than about policy.
Yes.
This court has produced a policy, which is to say the 1967 occupation, which continues in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, is illegal.
And you would say that this goes beyond what's enshrined in UN Resolutions 242 and 338 in its legal implications.
Yes. What they have said, and this may or may not happen, it depends on the political will of the international community, and I'll come back to that. But the meaning of the advisory opinion is that settlers should go home. All settlers should return to Israel. Settlements should cease. Now, that is a politically difficult thing to achieve, but it is what the law says. More important, perhaps, is what it means for what they call third states, people like us, the US, UK, Europe. What the ruling, or the advisory opinion says is no third state should assist the occupation in any way. What does that mean? It means don't help Israel to perpetuate the occupation because it's not legal anymore. You mentioned 242 and 338. They were about withdrawal, in a sense, land for peace. That was what they were. This is more about trying to impose international law, the Fourth Geneva Convention, on a political and military situation. And it poses questions for us. It's quite important for a country like the UK, and I would argue the US, to uphold international law as the kind of framework in which we live.
Not only as a framework in which we live, but as the ordering principles of international life.
Exactly. So we need some safety nets, we need some framework, we need some structure to our lives as countries as well as individuals. Individually, we have national law. Internationally, we're not so lucky. We don't have that
And
framework.
that's really what the Disorder Podcast is about. So there's this important change in the ICJ opinion. I think that that's critical, and it's something that's happened. We've had other episodes where we talked about how the South Africans brought the other case to the ICJ, and I'll put a link for that episode with Sasha Pulikow-Saransky of Foreign Policy in our show notes. I think that that's also quite instructive. So there's been this year, there's been this diplomacy and these court cases, but where are we? How has all of that changed the top table view in Western capitals as well as in Beijing on the future of the conflict?
I believe that the Gaza tragedy and the tragedy in Israel means that whereas for 10 years at least, this issue was not even on the agenda since John Kerry, 2013-14, when he made an effort to address the conflict. It's back on the public and international agenda. It's caused demonstrations and outbursts in the US, the UK, and across Europe. The need to resolve the conflict rather than to manage it, I think, is now better known. Where does that take us? We have a very weak Palestinian leadership and a very strong and militaristic, currently, Israeli leadership, the latter being uninterested in negotiations and implacably opposed to a Palestinian state.
And they may be deliberately disordering, as we've spoken about in previous episodes, whereby Netanyahu needs the disorder to continue to stay in power so that he won't go to jail for his own corruption cases.
True. So then you ask the question, what's good for us? Is it good for the US and the UK for this issue to be a constant, chronic drain on political, humanitarian, migration resources? Migration, not so much, because as you said earlier, the people of Gaza can't go anywhere. They can't go into Egypt, they can't go into Israel.
No, but it disorders the whole world. The existence of this conflict makes it nearly impossible for there to be the political will to deal with the Sudanese civil war, to resolve things in Syria, and those conflicts emit millions and millions of migrants. If I could digress for a second, when I first lived in Jerusalem in 2000, and the Second Intifada broke out after the failure of the Barak-Arafat Camp David negotiations, I had an insight. We're living in a world where it doesn't matter if a new and better form of cancer drug is invented or some great synthetic fiber that makes pants not wrinkle. if it can't be distributed. And it can't be distributed and people can't benefit from it because this Israel-Palestine conflict just disorders hundreds of millions of people's lives in the Arab and Muslim world because they focus on it and their leaders use it to distract them from doing internal reforms. And it's a reason that they're anti-Western, and then they're not willing to work with the West, and then we can't fight together on climate change. And it's just symbolic of our inability to work together for a shared goal. And if we didn't put this right, even though it's this tiny bit of the world and less than 1% of the world's population lives in Israel-Palestine, it's even geographically and humanitarianly insignificant relative to some of these larger civil wars. But if we don't put it right because of its emotional and media importance, it will be impossible to deal with things like AI regulation and all these other civil wars that have broken out. Like I had that insight in 2000, and that's where we're at now. So you're saying there's more top table focus because of the tragedies that are unfolding, that this needs to get done. But I don't see anything happening to get it over the line. I was hoping that Biden would allow Jake Sullivan and Blinken to work with the Qataris and the Saudis to propose something big. I mean, really big. And then that Biden would go to the Knesset and say, you know what? We fully support you. We've done all this stuff. But the answer is you're not trying to solve this. I call for 5 Likud MPs to resign. And if they do, and there are new elections, I'm going to release a $100 billion aid package for the Israeli high-tech sector and for Israelis to study in the U.S. and new partnerships with Silicon Valley. And the Qataris and Saudis have announced a $100 billion initiative for the rebuilding of Gaza and the West Bank, and for Palestinians to study in the Gulf and to have opportunities there. And if you guys do this and the Palestinians do that, we are going to get all of this over the line. I think the 5 Likud MPs would have dropped out, but he didn't do that. So I don't see Sunak proposing like, hey, we're going to allow these Palestinian students to come here and we're going to whatever. It was just the talk, and the regular BS. So where really are those big proposals?
I think there's an issue of double standards. There's an issue of double standards to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Your answer is, in my opinion, not a reality, not what's going to happen. Where we are, in my opinion, is that we have a friend of the West in Israel, from whom little is expected politically and a lot is given. So there is automatic support from the West for Israel's contest with Iran. That's clear and will continue. But is Israel acting as a good faith actor when it comes to the Palestinians?
Well, no one thinks that they are.
You'll remember Guterres saying and being castigated for saying after the 7th of October, this didn't happen in a vacuum. We've talked a little bit about the things that have been going on, but they've been going on since 67, maybe 48, but 67. So in a circumstance where your friend is misbehaving with the Palestinians, what do? You protect your friend from Iran, that's for sure. You observe what they do with Hizbollah, that's for sure. But when it comes to the treatment of the Palestinians, is it unrealistic to expect the US and the UK and France and Germany to argue for equal rights, which means equal security, equal opportunity? In my opinion, that would need to be in 2 states. Takes us on to the question of recognition of the state of Palestine. But that's not enough. Can there be an outcome where Israelis, because they are the people with the power, they have control of the land. There is a one-state reality, and that one-state reality is Israeli control from the river to the sea. That is not disputed. That is actually sought by Mr. Netanyahu and achieved by Mr. Netanyahu. Can that change? Unless it does, then we're required to witness an ongoing situation of discrimination. Some would say apartheid in the West Bank and occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, which the court has just said is illegal. Fine. So can one persuade, because persuasion is needed rather than coercion, can one persuade the people of Israel, who are traumatized by 7 October and have not got past that, and one can understand why and sympathize, can one persuade the Israeli people that a better way forward than the one prescribed by their prime minister is one of coexistence and mutual security, enabling the Palestinians to have a decent life as well?
Well, there's an argument that they were persuaded, both in the premierships of Rabin, Peres, and Barak. But the Palestinians didn't put the John Hancock on the deal. You know what I mean? So that there is an Israeli narrative here that I feel like you're not paying attention to. The Israeli people feel that they tried peace in the years of the late 80s to 2001, and they were ready to dismantle settlements and give back territory. And then what was their reward? A series of terror bombings.
There are spoilers on both sides of this equation. I hesitate to say it, but I will say it. Some of the Israeli spoilers are now in office, in the shape of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, whom we've touched upon, of course. But their ambition is to push Gazans into Egypt and to push
100%. And
West Bank Palestinians into Jordan.
They stated.
Yeah. So they're not safe. They are not sortables, as the French would say. They are not the sort of people that we should be doing business with. But they're in the Israeli government. So we do. Now, your historic references are valid. There are two sides to every story. But I don't believe the Israeli propaganda that Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They are the weaker party throughout this story, militarily, economically, politically, even legally.
Yes.
What they've got on their side is this issue of international law. There is a clear view, not just by the court, but by Western states, that the occupation and its conduct is wrong. The settlements are wrong. Condemned by Starmer, Sunak, Biden, Kamala, you name it. So something needs to change if Israel is going to conform with international law. I come back to my point about double standards. It doesn't work to have a framework of international law where you or I can cherry pick which state I like and which state I don't. International law needs to be applied evenly if it's going to work.
Sir Vincent, I think the occupation should be illegal too, and that's all well and good. But when you talk about double standards of Western support for Israel no matter what, I think we need to talk about Western standards in international justice institutions just criticizing Israel and pointing out Israeli violations of human rights law without pointing out how Israel's adversaries violate every sort of international law. Hamas obviously violated international law in massacring civilians. But what are the international legal rulings that punish Hamas? You might say it's very difficult to punish Hamas because they're not a sovereign actor. But I see the West and Hamas's allies in the Gulf and elsewhere as responsible for blocking Iranian shipments to it and doing sanctions of people who send stuff to Hamas, and they didn't implement those sanctions. So there should be sanctions about dual-use items going into the Palestinian territories because Palestinians are known now to have Hamas inside them and to use dual-use items for military purposes. Where's the international law on that? And if we look at Lebanon, obviously, Hezbollah gave Israel the casus belli by launching all these missiles. But the Lebanese state also has given Israel a casus belli to invade it by allowing the missiles to be smuggled and then launched. They violated UN Resolution 1701. But the Lebanese state is not being taken to the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice and being put through the ringer the way that Israel is, because they'd say, well, Lebanon isn't a real democracy. Lebanon doesn't have sovereignty over its territory. Lebanon is weak. And you're right, the Palestinian Authority and the Lebanese state are very weak. But those can't be excuses. If you're going to have international law against Israel, there needs to be international law trials against not just Hamas and Hezbollah, but the Palestinian state or state in becoming, the Palestinian Authority, and the Lebanese state and the Yemeni state, and then have rulings that are enforced. Otherwise, I'm going to see a double standard there opposite to the one that you've pointed out earlier. I hope that you feel that you've learned something in this first part of our October 7th commemoration episode. Please join me again tomorrow, directly on October 8th, to hear more about how the war in Israel and Gaza and the October 7th have left the question of Palestinian statehood on the international diplomatic scene, as well as in Britain's actions towards Palestinian statehood. We're also going to order the disorder tomorrow about what the US, the UN, and Britain can be doing to try to resolve the conflict in the Middle East and to bring about Palestinian statehood. Our producer has been the one, the only, the George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I hope you have an orderly week.